The story of Yigal Allon had both two sides. One is the history, or namely biography, because it's a person. On the one hand, on the other hand, there is the question of the topic of historiography, because Allon, that died in 1980, and as Professor Zweig already said, he was a very important Israeli politician, received a full, let's say half full, biography only in the year 2004 by one of the most important historians in Israel, Anita Shapira. And she decided that Allon biography should not be written beyond the line of 1949. Okay, and this decision of hers calls for attention, and of course I belong to those who didn't agree that it's the right thing to do. Hence, I wrote the second biography, the second chapter of his biography, and the book was published, the first version in Hebrew was published in 2016. It's 470 pages, quite extensive, and then a year ago I managed to make a much shorter English version because I thought that the English reader shouldn't or wouldn't be so interested in the, let's say, the inner questions of Israeli politics, or mostly the question of, the movement, kibbutz movement, because Yigal Allon was a kibbutz member. So instead of 470 pages in Hebrew, in English it's only 188, okay? So it's kind of, of promoting the book. It's only 188 pages with pictures and 2 maps, okay? So let me start with telling it, for those of you who doesn't know who is Yigal Allon, a very short CV of Yigal Allon. He was born in 1918, okay, in the little village of Kfar Tavor, which is 15 minutes today from Afula. It's in the slopes of the Israel Valley, okay? He was born to a family that came from Europe. I won't go into the history. There is a very interesting anecdote. He was born because his father got a few days of vacation. He was a soldier in the Ottoman army during the First World War. So he came to his place, to his home in January 1918, and then in October 1918, you can do the math. So Yigal Allon was born, okay? Now, he joined the Israeli, before the Israel state was there, okay? He joined the security forces of the about to be born Israel, already in 1939, 1936, when he was 18, okay? And then he started his military career that reached its peak in 1948, okay? He was the most important battlefield commander of the IDF. He wrote some interesting chapters in military history in the north in May 1948, and then in the center of the state in July 1948, and then in the south from October 1948 all the way to the end of the Independence War, January 1949. He was guest of the French army in October 1949 when his host came and saluted him for his promotion, because they heard that Moshe Dayan, a much more famous Israeli figure that the same age of Allon, one of his friends, they started together the career, was promoted from the chief of the commander of the Jerusalem area to the post of the commander of the southern front. So the French army officials understood that if Moshe Dayan is promoted from Jerusalem to the south, then Allon, which was the commander of the south, became the chief of staff. But no, this was the way of Ben-Gurion to dismiss Allon. Just waited that Allon would go to France as the visitant of the French army, and he just promoted Moshe Dayan. It was like saying to Yigal Allon, I don't want you anymore in the IDF. And this is this is the crisis. This is the crucial moment when Allon make a decision not to go with Ben-Gurion. Hence, the decision of Anita Shapira to suggest that everything Allon did from 49 onwards, namely 31 years, doesn't have any historical importance. Okay, so of course I don't agree with it. I'm not the only one. And I will try to convince you that ignoring or neglecting Yigal Allon's biography is ignoring or neglecting the real history of Israeli politics. Namely, the question is not Yigal Allon. I'm not his son, I'm not his nephew, I'm not his grandfather, I'm nothing. I mean, in terms of, sentimental point of view, nothing. I'm an Israeli citizen, I'm 57 years old. I was born much later than Allon. I remember when I was a soldier, 1980. I remember the moment. I was standing in the bus, going back to my place. I was in the Air Force, standing in the bus, like this, trying not to sleep. And then all of a sudden, I have the beep of the Israeli news, 10 a.m. Friday morning, February 29th. I remember the moment. Just many Americans remember, where were you when Kennedy, whatever, okay? So, or in Israeli terms, where were you when Rabin was assassinated? Now, Allon wasn't assassinated. He died from cardiac problems. But I remember the moment. I'm not the only Israeli that remembers it. 29th of February 1980, and I knew nothing about Yigal Allon. I only felt that something bad happened because we missed, the Israeli society now is missing one of its best politicians. Later, much later, more than 30 years later, I started to dig into the issue, and my argument is very simple. If you want to understand the real anatomy of Israeli politics, not only from 1949, but especially from 1967 on, all the way to this date, you must go through the legacy of Yigal Allon. Again, not the person per se, but his politics. Why? I'll try to explain as best as I can. Not before completing his short CV. Okay, 1949, he goes out from the army. 1950, goes to Oxford. 1952, he comes back to Israel and starts his political career. Okay, 1955, he becomes a Knesset member, and from 1961, he's a minister all the way to 1977. 16 years in the government, okay? Officially he was Minister of Labor, and then Minister of Absorption, and then Minister of Education for 5 years, and then Foreign Minister from 74 to 77. But much more important, as far as I understand it, and I think that Allon would agree, that parallelly to his official role as a minister of this or minister of that, he was part of the Israeli cabinet. So he was in the very, very place where the Israeli government make decisions to go to war, not to go to war, to go nuke or not to go nuke, to go out with his plan, the famous Allon plan. You can Wikipedia it, you can Google it, and it's there. Okay, so what is the Allon plan? So he was in the center of the decision making. And this is all the way from 1961 to 1977. Now, what happens in 1977? Those of you who doesn't know or who forgot, in 1977 we have what we call in Hebrew the Mahapach, namely the change, the big change, when the left Zionist wing, Mapai, the Mapai party was formed in 1930 and became the major power in Israeli politics before Israel existed, from 1933 all the way to 1977, 44 years. Okay, we're talking about persons like, the most famous one, of course, is Ben Gurion, but then we have Eshkol, the prime minister of Israel in the Six-Day War, and then we have Golda Meir, the famous Golda Meir, and then we have the even more famous Yitzhak Rabin. Okay, that his first role as a prime minister was between 74 and 77, and Allon was his foreign minister. Okay, so 77 is the turning point in Israeli politics when the right Zionist wing, comes to power. And then Allon had 3 years in the opposition, and from late 79 or early 1980, he starts to prepare himself for competing for being the leader of the labor movement, Labor Party, better say, in preparing himself to the election of 1981. And, okay, his heart failed him, and the rest is history, or the rest is written in my book, and I hope more research will be dedicated to Yigal Allon. Now, so we have the CV, we have the great thesis of mine as a historian that dedicates his mind to politics. The most important focus should be put on the decision making. If you want to understand politics, it's not what's written in New York Times, this or that editorial op-ed, okay, which is important. I'm not saying that the newspapers are not important, but if you want to understand politics, especially Israeli politics, you must go to the acme of politics, okay? The decision makers, which is not even the government. Israeli government, the first Israeli government was made by 13 ministers. 20 years later, the government had already 26 ministers. You shouldn't ask all the ministers what each and every one of them think. You should look for the 5 or 7, sometimes 3 decision makers. And there you can find the politics, okay? And the main 2 figures in the period I'm trying to cover, and which my book covers all the way to 1980, is on the one hand Yigal Allon with his policy, and I'll try to describe it in a few seconds. And the other person I also already reminded his name, Moshe Dayan. Okay? Even though they came from the same village, in Hebrew it sounds better, they came from the same place. They have the same heritage. Moshe Dayan also was born in an agricultural farm. He was a farmer. He was in the Palmach. He was an Israeli commander. He was Sabra. You know the word. I hope the young people here know the term Sabra, the one that was born. Native Israeli, okay? Native Zionist, okay? Even though they are the same height, okay? Allon had 2 eyes. Moshe Dayan had only 1 eye, but that's it. They are the same person, actually. When it goes to politics, it's 180 degrees, not 360. 180 degrees diametrically opposed. Okay? To cut a very long story and complicated story short, if I dare to define what is the difference, of course, I'm influenced by the news of today because I'm an Israeli citizen. I live today, but still, with all those reservations, I dare to say that the most important, the deepest question is the place Israel should have in the Middle East. What is the place of Jews in general and their homeland or state or whatever you want to call it, Israel in one word, in the Middle East? Moshe Dayan thought, and he said it clearly in 1956, that we are strangers in this area. We don't belong. We have nothing to do with the Arab world. And they hate us with reason. And they will hate us to the end of times. Hence, only security and security and security. There's no way to make any move in the political ground. No peace is possible. Now, I guess some of you know that Dayan was there with Menachem Begin in 1977 as a foreign minister that signed the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. So those of you who know a little bit of history might contradict me right now. Do not. Wait for a second. Wait for the part where you ask questions and said, your thesis doesn't stand criticism because, in fact, Dayan signed the peace treaty with Egypt. So I gave you an idea what to ask me later, okay? But right now I want to make the difference, to paint in black and white, so to speak, okay, the differences between Dayan and Allon. Allon, on the other hand, thought of the Jews and the state of Israel as part of the region. He knew, not less than Dayan, that there is hostility, a very deep hostility and a very deep anger, so to speak, from the Arab side toward the Jews. Because of what happened in 48, because of the partition plan, because of Zionism, never mind. He knew, he wasn't a pacifist. It's not a clash between, someone that knows reality and, some hippie that plays the guitar like John Lennon and said, imagine there is no. We're talking about two persons that knows everything about security, everything about defense, everything about army, everything about commandment, everything about arms, etc. But as for the Moshe Dayan, the crucial situation of Israel is the end point. This is the bottom line. For Yigal Allon, it's point of departure. His idea is that Israel as an emerging power, progressive power, from the 1950s on, with the absorption and the development of the economy, etc., okay, Israel should do whatever she can in order to advance toward peace. Now, the way to advance toward peace, according to Allon, is to have, Israel must have defensible borders. That's why he rejects in 1948 the policy of Ben-Gurion to stop the war in what you know today as the Green Line. Okay, the ceasefire lines of 1949, let's say January 49 to make, or April or July 49, never mind, 49. So we have the Green Line all the way from 49 to 67, or what we call today the lines of June 4th, because the Six-Day War started on June 5th, okay, and ended 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, Six-Day War, and then on June 11, the next day, Six-Day War, and Allon says, now the War of 48 ended. So 19 years later, he says, finally, we finished the war. Now it's time to make a peace. Allon used to say in 49, we won the war, but we lost the peace. How come? According to Allon, IDF should have conquered all the territory, all the way to what was back then a British mandate, all the way to the Jordan River, and then to make peace with the Arabs. Since Ben-Gurion, for very good reason, decided not to do so, so according to Allon, Israel had to wait all the way to 67 in order to have more territories, in order to have defensible borders, in order to make peace. Okay, hence his plan, the famous Allon plan. Again, I'm saying famous because for us it's famous. Those of you who never heard about it, going to Google it later, and going to be there is the Wikipedia in English, in Hebrew, in many languages. Okay, the Allon plan was formed after the Six-Day War. Allon said something very simple: Israel must remain in territories which are important for her security, and where there's no big, dense Arab population. He called these two parameters that Israel government must keep. Okay, so again, to hold territories which are both important for the Israeli defense and doesn't jeopardize the democracy of Israel, namely not dense in terms of our population. Okay, by this, Allon would say, it's like we are saying to the Arab world, this is our interest, and we're not going to touch. Let's go to the specific territory in the West Bank. You have the mountain, what we call in Hebrew Yehuda v'Shomron, or Samaria and Judea. Okay, and you have cities like Nablus or Jenin or Ramallah, very dense in our population. These areas can be important in terms of army or for security, but Allon would say we're not going to sit there. Where? Yes, in the Jordan Valley. Why? Because it's important for security, and there's no Arab population over there. So this is the Allon plan. What was Dayan's opinion about before the war? Before the Six-Day War, Dayan opposed the war. During the war, Dayan did everything to stop the Israeli army as far as possible from those lines that Allon thought should be used for later as a trading chip. After the war, since IDF arrived where it arrived, okay, after the war, Dayan proposed that Jews should claim, and he wrote it and he said it many, many times, Jews must sit can sit, if they want, wherever they want. When Allon came with his plan, Dayan came with his Dayan plan. Let's build 5 Jewish cities in Samaria. We have Nablus. We're going to make near Nablus a Jewish city. Near Ramallah, later you can watch it, you can open a map and see what I'm talking about. But the idea is very clear. Put Jewish city, 5 Jewish cities like near 5 Arab cities, and by this, there's no way you can make what we called since then a territorial compromise. This was Allon's main concept. The only way to arrive to peace with the Arabs is to make a territorial compromise. Allon was basing his concept also on the basis on his interpretation of the resolution of the Security Council of the UN 242, the famous 242. Again, you can Wikipedia it, it's easy, okay? On November 22nd, 1967, those of you who like dates, so you can write, November 22nd, 1967, the UN Security Council came out with the resolution 242, which talks, among other things, about secure borders. So what are secure borders in terms of Allon? Defensible borders. So the idea, according to the Israel interpretation of 242, or the Allon interpretation of 242, is that a territorial compromise should and would and could be achieved with time. Dayan, and later Shimon Peres, which was his partner in the political field, okay, it was his partner since 1950s. I'm talking about Shimon Peres, the famous Shimon Peres that passed away 2 years ago, even less, okay? But back then, he was like number 2 of Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan passed away in 1981, and then from then on, Peres becomes, the famous Peres. But Peres was quite important back then, but he was number 2 with Dayan, and he had the same concept. So again, whereas for Allon, territorial compromise is the best way to advance in the direction to peace with the Arabs, appeasement. Okay, Dayan and Peres were in favor of functional compromise. What is functional compromise? Functional compromise means, according to Dayan and Peres, that the Arabs have their home rule in questions of sewage, education, health, municipality, whereas Israel is keeping the question of security, namely controlling the territory. So it's like Allon would say, would argue with them, would say, you are separating the people from the territory. It's a concept that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. There's no way that the Palestinians would accept separation between their personal or communal interests, sewage, education, health, etc., and their sovereignty of the land. Now, who would be, according to Allon, the partner to this kind of policy? For Allon, it was clear, not from the beginning. In the beginning of 1967, after the war, he was thinking about local leadership, but very fast he started to think about the Jordan kingdom, King Hussein. So we have Allon, again, I'm trying to summarize. We have Allon, territorial compromise, okay, defensible borders, and the Arab partner to go forward in a peace process is Hussein. Whereas for Peres and Dayan, okay, it's functional compromise. Jews can sit wherever they want, and the partner for no peace is the PLO. How come? Okay, Dayan used to say, let me start from another point. Dayan was asked in 1968 by a French journalist, "What do you want to meet? Do you want to meet with Yasser Arafat?" And Dayan said, "Of course, I want to meet with everyone. Why not?" No, and the journalist said, "Because Arafat is against any kind of compromise." And Dayan says, "Exactly. This is the reason why I want to meet with him, because Arafat represents the real authenticity of the Palestinian point of view. This was Dayan's vision from 1956. Again, Arab hates Jews. Jews might hate Arabs or not hate, it doesn't matter, because Arabs are the majority in the region, tens and tens of millions, and the Israelis can have the best army ever, and the Arabs are outnumbering them. So the only way to protect the security of the state of Israel is what? To have the tiebreaker of this situation. What is the tiebreaker? That Israel would go nuke. So Dayan and Peres and Ben-Gurion from late 1950s are starting with the project of the nuclear arm against their own government. Later, in 1961, there is a new president, new young and idealist president in the White House. Okay, Kennedy is against the proliferation of nuclear arms. So he's getting into a clash with Ben-Gurion. This is why, according to my interpretation, okay, Ben-Gurion resigns from the government in June 1963 in order to stall the inspection of the American government, namely Kennedy. Later, in November 63, Kennedy is assassinated. Don't think that Ben-Gurion assassinated Kennedy. This is not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say, I'm saying that with these stalling tactics, Israel could cross the no return line in question of the nuclear project. Now comes Johnson, the vice president of Kennedy, and Eshkol, the next prime minister after Ben-Gurion. Are you following me? Okay, it's kind of, a freaky history and a creepy history, because we don't like to talk about nuke. But what can I do? I'm a historian. So neglecting the nuclear issue is like neglecting, the race problem in the US. There's no problem between white and black. Okay, let's ignore it. It's ridiculous, right? So there's no way to ignore the clash between those two forces in the Israeli government. Again, it's not opposition against coalition. It's in the very, very top of decision makers. What is the best way of Israel to confront the security question? Allon would suggest moving toward peace, momentum. He used the Latin word, momentum. Whereas the other party would use the term status quo. These two terms, momentum and status quo, are like the backbone of my thesis, of my book. Allon used to say we are in favor of movement. We are for the movement. Not only security issues. Allon was a very good minister of education. And I don't have time to go into the social and economic issues because I want to finish with this nuclear story so you'll understand what I'm talking about. So I'm going back to 64. Okay? Kennedy was assassinated November 22, 1963, and we have Ben-Gurion resigned in June 16, 1963. And then in 64, we have Johnson as the president, Eshkol the prime minister. They're lowering down the clash between those two countries and reach an agreement that was signed, and you can read it online. It's a top secret. It used to be a top secret document that now it's online in the official website of the Israeli archives. No more, no less. It's called Memorandum of Understanding, 10 of March, 1965. And the second section says like this: Israel will not be the first country to introduce a nuclear weapon into the Israeli Arab region. Signed by Eshkol on the one hand, and the people of the White House, I think was Dean Rusk, I'm not sure, never mind, okay, the White House on the other. This document is like the basis of the Israeli policy towards a nuclear weapon, never to be used. It's there because of the stalling tactics, but never going to be used, it would never be declared. Hence, it's not part of Israel's strategy. What is the Israeli strategy? Defensible borders. Hence, the clash in the top of Israeli government before Six-Day War. I don't know if any of you knows that in June 1st, when Dayan became the defense minister in the very, very big united Israeli government, government of unity before the war, okay, instead of 70 Knesset members, all of a sudden they have 110. In 1965, Dayan and Peres resigned from Mapai, created their own party called Rafi. They talked about science, which was like the buzzword to say we are in favor of nuclear power, nuclear weapon. It was like a code in the Israeli election of 1965, thinking that only by using the name Ben Gurion they would win the election. They lost. Eshkol, this quasi-ridiculous Jew with his Yiddish jokes, gefilte fish jokes, won 45 seats in the Knesset, while Ben Gurion, the great, in the San Martin in terms of Argentina, or the Washington of your terms, okay, received only 10. So Peres and Dayan goes to the opposition, the worst place to be in democracy. Because in opposition you can do nothing, you can, speak. That's it, write articles. The decision making is in the government. So the crisis of the period of the, we call it in Hebrew, hamtana, the period of how do you say it in English? Help me. Waiting time, 3 weeks before the war, Six-Day War broke, starts in May 15 all the way to June 5, you can make it, so 3 weeks, 3 days, 4 days before the war began, the public pressure made by Dayan and the press that helped him to do so, put him in the government. So in the ballots in 65, he lost. Dayan himself said, I needed 80,000 Egyptian soldiers in order to get into the government. So this is parliamentary democracy. It's funny. I mean, it's very interesting, but sometimes it's tragic. Okay, let's go back to the nuclear issue. The very same day that Dayan becomes defense minister, Shimon Peres puts an offer. In order to solve the problem of the crisis, we have 100,000 Egyptian soldiers, 200,000 Israeli soldiers, everyone waiting for Johnson to do something, the UN to do something. Nothing happens. Peres offers to make a nuclear explosion in the south. What would he gain by this? The idea was rejected. Don't worry, because we know it never happened. But how do I know it? Peres wrote it by himself in 1970. Bypassing Israeli censorship, publishing it in England, in an English book that was published in England. And we have other sources that say, telling the same story. By exploding a nuclear device in the south, not killing necessarily even one soldier. It's not the point. The point is that you explode, you make a nuclear explosion, and then you nullify the agreement, the opacity agreement of 10 of March 1965. Remember? I was talking about it 20 minutes. You lost me? Complicated? Remember the opacity agreement between the US and Israel? Okay, so we have an opposition within the Israeli government that even though Eshkol, the prime minister, signed a pact with the US that Israel would never use the nuclear power, now, in the eve of a war, Peres offers to explode, to make a nuclear explosion, so to avoid the war. Avoiding the war means status quo. No territorial gain, no defensible borders, no trade ship in order to make peace. This is the Allon strategy. Okay, so he gains two things. Nullification of the opacity. Israel goes nuke openly. I don't want to think about what would the international community think about this move. You can guess, okay? So what were the results of the Six-Day War? And with this, I'm I'm arriving to my to closing my argument, because I can go on talk about the clash between those two forces, not for good, but 3 more hours easily, without breathing, without drinking water, okay? Because there are many ramifications. The question of the PLO I mentioned before, and the question of the settlements I mentioned, and there are many others, okay? But summing up, okay, we have Allon strategy, Allon way of thinking, the momentum, the bargain chip, territory as a bargain chip, territorial compromise, and one more thing, Allon always spoke about interim agreements. The conflict between Israelis and Arabs wouldn't be solved like this, okay? It's a question of step by step, creating atmosphere of mutual trust. This is exactly what happened between Israel and Egypt in 1975 with the brokery of Kissinger. Okay, it was the first government of Rabin. Again, Rabin prime minister, Allon foreign minister. Who is the defense minister of Rabin? Shimon Peres. Who's trying to do anything to block this interim agreement between Israel and Egypt? Shimon Peres, from the very Israeli government. Okay, so this is the story of that decade, or those 2 decades. I think the best way to understand Israeli history starting from 67 is to go 10 years before, namely from 57, and to go all the way to 77. Once you understand those 20 years, I think you have like the key or the DNA or the anatomy of the Israeli politics all the way to this date, because those 2 main, let's say, 2 main tendencies, what I called, or they called, momentum versus status quo, is still here. Let me, to close my argument, let me read something that Allon said in 1972, and then I shut up. I mean, I'll breathe, okay? Listen up. 1972. The moment Israel adopts a policy that takes the provisional reality for permanent, that the existing situation is the desirable situation, at this very moment we will experience a revolt in a series of terms and dimensions. On the foreign front, we, and only we, will be held accountable for the lack of peace in the region. Also friends, not to mention foes, will distance themselves from us, if not worse. This decline in our international status will encourage the tendency for military actions against us. In the territories, it will sow seeds of despair and turbulence, and I doubt we will be able to keep on achieving in the territories what we have accomplished until now. No less important, on the domestic front, our belief in our just policies and right ways will be shaken, especially among younger generations. Okay, so these things that Allon said in 1972, it's no less than visionary. Okay, so he wasn't, he didn't have a crystal ball, and he wasn't philosophizing about, he wasn't, like me, a historian, he was making history. The problem in his case and his partners, that there were 2 sides. Okay, so politics is also always about clash between opposing forces. In this case, as I said many times in my lecture, you should look at the top of the scale and not coalition, opposition, left, right. Let me read something, one little section, another thing that Allon said about left and right, okay? Allon rejected, I'm reading something from my book, okay? Allon rejected the prevailing terms of that period, dove and hawk. Today it would be right and left, okay? Depicting them as simplistic. Allon sustained that any person that cares about the security of his country but strives for peace with his enemies is both dove and hawk, which makes this division irrelevant. So if you want to understand the Israeli discourse of this day, we have like the extremes that goes right and left. The right depicts the left as traitors, the left depicts the right as fascists, whereas Allon said it's not a question of left and right, it's a question of political content. Okay, it's more a question of momentum versus status quo, optimism versus pessimism, a conventional army versus nuclear, territorial compromise versus functional compromise, going with Hussein or going with the PLO, which is going nowhere, etc. I think I made my point quite clear, I hope. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience.
You didn't talk about the domestic policies heritage of Yigal Allon. Minister of Education,
Yeah.
I remember him as a prominent Minister of Education.
Yeah.
So I'd like to invite you to say something about that, but I'd also like to get back to the central issue, the difference between Dayan and Allon. On the one hand, you argue the Allon plan that Allon believed in defensive borders, and that the Allon plan is marked by Israel holding on to the River Jordan line. On the other hand, he wants to integrate into the Middle East to make peace with the Arabs, return territories.
Yeah.
Does he really believe that he can find Arab leaders with which he can make peace, with whom he can make peace, if he wants to return not territories, but only a small part of it?
That's right. That's a very good question. I start with the second because I'm going to read some four lines from the book. It's a testimony given by Allon in 1979, relating straight to your question, because people would say, and a very, very important historian, I think from Oxford, Avi Schleim, which is the biographer of Hussein, he wrote clearly that Hussein rejected the Allon plan. And I was depicting Allon in terms of an Israeli that seeks solution vis-a-vis Hussein. Now, Avi Schleim, which is the biographer of Hussein, says that Hussein said that the Allon plan is totally unacceptable. So, if Avi Schleim is right, then Dayan is right. Because Dayan said the same. With who? You're going to make, they were saying about Allon, you're playing chess with yourself. Now, today we have the smartphones, we play with ourselves, but back then people used to play one with the other. So who do you play your politics with? If Hussein is rejecting the Allon plan. Now, Allon said about this in 19, for a moment I did not expect to receive a positive answer from the king. I hold to the theory by which, in terms of territory, no single Arab leader would be prepared to compromise without being strongly endorsed by Muslim countries. So why? Why bother? The clue is in the interim way of thinking. It's not either or. It's not black and white. You don't jump from 0 to 100 unless your name is Usain Bolt. Okay? He can do it. But normal people cannot go from 0 to 100. So in my book, there is a chapter. The title, the editor wouldn't let me. I wanted to leave the title totally unacceptable, interrogation sign, and the editor didn't like the English, so he added another word. Never mind, solution. So in this chapter, I'm dealing with 3 times that Allon and Hussein were approaching this interim step in order to make, what we call in Hebrew, uvdot bashetach, how do you say it, to create facts on the ground, not big words, like, Shimon Peres. The big, the future, the big visionary. He became like Madre Teresa in the last 10 years. It's ridiculous from historical point of view. I respect him. Shimon Peres was a great person, no question about it, but don't make him Madre Teresa. In the 1970s, he did all of his power, and he had the power, political power, to block the interim agreement between Israel and Egypt. And the interim agreement of 1975 was the first step on the way to Israel and Egypt to make the peace agreement of 1979. The fact that there was a change, a political change in 77, and from Mapai, Labour Party, it came Likud, from Rabin became Begin, Doesn't matter because Egypt is there, Israel is there. So Allon and Hussein, 3 times, 1970, the famous Black September, which was black for the PLO and for Dayan, but it was pink for Allon and for Hussein. Are you following me? Don't think Arab and Jews. Think momentum Arab, momentum Israelis, status quo Arabs, status quo Israelis, and the coalitions. Are you following me? Okay, so we learned this wisdom from the ancient Greeks. Politics is not always France against Germany. You have to look, or England, the Brexit. There were British that were in favor of the Brexit, and there were British that were against the Brexit. And the same goes to Germany, because everyone gains something from this. So let's go back to Allon and Hussein. In 1970, in 1972, in 1974, 3 times that Allon and Hussein were moving in these directions of an interim facts on the ground, without big words. Okay, so this would be a very short answer. It wasn't that short, but you have to read the chapter, which is not very long. Okay, and of course it can be more elaborated. There are much more to say because there are many facts. Okay, now as concerns the education, let me read a section of Allon's speech he delivered in the Knesset in 1972, the same year that was, okay? In our countries, he was a minister of education back then. He was a minister of education from 69 to 74, and he used to say that for him it was the most important job he did for the country. I don't agree with him, but he didn't ask me, okay? I was a teenager back then when he was minister of education. I was in high school. Even less, okay? In a speech, okay, so in our country live side by side 2 peoples, Jews as a majority and the Arabs as a minority. The Jewish majority is divided according to countries of origin, cultural background, ethnic groups, social classes, political tendencies, religious denominations, and seculars. Seculars are also divided by ideological beliefs, and so are religious. In a similar way, the minority is divided to Muslims, Christians, Jews, Circassians, Bedouin, tribes, social hamulas. It is the right of every citizen to live according to his own beliefs and to educate his children accordingly, but on condition that common denominator is safeguarded. So I think it's the progressivism and its best way of definition. Today we call it multiculturalism, and in 1970s it says that Israel wasn't the melting pot policy, which tried to ignore differences. No, you can see the Minister of Education is his his most basic values. Okay, let me go on. According to the safeguard, it is not for us to pass people through the melting pot. 1972, and we should not engineer the human spirit. We should aim at integrating different identities as a basis of pluralism that demands openness towards the other, to the fellow being, and also demands mutual respect. Intolerance breeds hostility, alienation, and violence. So this is the way he thinks about education. One more thing that he used to say, democracy is a 3-channel issue, 3-channel thing. One is the formal democracy, one person, one vote. This is obvious. Political rights, to be elected, to elect, etc. The other is what he calls social democracy. Democracy should be measured on social dimension, namely the possibility of a person to have good life. So it means, in other words, economy. And then the third point, it's cultural democracy, which means that every person, not only kids from the age of 4 to the age of 18 must have education, but also adults. He believed that it's the mission of the society through its institutions to safeguard the right of each and every citizen to have access to culture. So this was democracy for him. So I think it gives you an idea of his way of thinking in the terms of domestic issues. One more thing, let me read something about what he used to call ethics in politics. Today it sounds like science fiction, both for Americans and Israelis. I won't mention names of leaders. We all know them, okay? He used to talk about ethics in politics, meaning, what is ethics in politics? Allegiance to democratic values of both procedures and essence, honesty and candid public enlisting, loyalty to the truth on facts, candidate, platform, policy, performance, means, cost, political situation, economy, society, events, number, processes, accomplishment, failures, demands, and promises. Why not? Okay? In other words, to lie in politics is like injecting poison into the national bloodstream. I have no doubt that when he wrote it in 1979, he was thinking about Shimon Peres. I have no doubt at all. Because the party politics that he had to encounter when fighting against who became the most important person in Labour Party were terrible. Why politics so important? Okay, for the citizens of the 21st century that is so cynical about politics with good reason, on good grounds. We don't respect our leaders with reason. Okay, but still, Allon said, politics deals with the future of the soul, of the nation, of the state. Politics decides on war and peace, on rich and poor, on education and culture. It is the architect of the future, the engineer of the present. Say no more. If we believe in democracy, we must embrace politics. Okay, so politics of honesty, but politics nevertheless. Okay, so I think I made this point quite clear.
If you examine his plan today, wouldn't you say that his plan was naive? In other words, based on the situation in the Middle East, his plan is a no-go, basically. My thinking that his significance is not that great because his ideas are not workable, and they were not workable ever. So, I mean, unless you think otherwise. But
I think otherwise. I think that the only solution for the Israeli-Palestinian problem goes through the Jordanian option. That's what they called in the 1960s, 1970s. And I must remind, instead of using the name of Allon, I would use another much more famous name, Rabin. When Rabin made his inauguration speech in June 74, when he became prime minister, he said, between the desert and the sea, there are place for only two states. I mean, the two-state solution that Netanyahu supposedly endorsed, and Obama spoke all the time. So they spoke about a non-viable two-state solution, namely two states to be erected between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Rabin in 74, echoing the Allon plan, spoke about two-state solution between the desert, namely between Iraq and the Mediterranean. Now, where exactly the border would pass between Jordan and Israel, and what would be the place of the Palestinians within this process, this remain open. Okay, but if you measure the things of today, if you're measuring this way of thinking to the slogans of today of two-state solution, you see that if there is a non-viable solution today, is the two-state solution proposed name, so to speak, by Netanyahu or Obama. Okay, it's empty words. So what would be the solution today? I don't know. And of course, there's no way to know what would Allon say today vis-a-vis issues like the ISIS or Hezbollah, etc., etc. I think he would stand behind his defensible borders and behind his optimistic way of thinking, but not naive. You said a very important word. Allon used to use it. He said, in regard of security issues, that we shouldn't be neither naive nor cynical. Okay, so naive would be the the left of Mapam, or today Meretz. This is naive. Okay, and the cynical would be the other side, Peres, Dayan, and of course the right wing. So neither cynicism, neither naivete, something in the middle. Now the issue of Yitzhak Sadeh, you're right. There is the famous picture in 1938. Yitzhak Sadeh stands, and these two disciples, Allon on one side and Dayan on the other. Dayan still with his two eyes. It's in Hanita, 1938. So they started from the same place, and then we go back to the question of this gentleman here. How come people that were raised from had the same background arrived to so opposing conclusions?
It was probably because Ben-Gurion was from the same party as Dayan.
In terms of this decision of but still the question remains why. I mean, Ben-Gurion died in a moment, and Dayan stayed, and Dayanism is still there. So the question, what is the purpose of Dayanism, still remains unsolved.
Thank you.
Thank you.